And I know, General Dempsey, you got a tough situation on your hands. What do we do if they literally shoot back at Americans, our friends, the Israelis?
First, just to clarify, this isn't about eliminating chemical weapons. That's not possible given the number and the distribution of them. It's about convincing the Assad regime that it's unacceptable for them to use them, and that's the limit of this military operation. We're postured for the possibility of retaliation, and I can assure you that our regional partners are as well.
Let me just ask that question a little bit, a little more clarification from you. You can, Jim. I know you're in the military and you're to the point. That's great. We're glad you're in charge. Can you see that escalating, though, with U.S. military involvement in the region? Have you made a contingency plan for that happening? Whatever the reaction is, the Syrians' reaction to us specifically, have you made contingency plans for us being in an escalated military operation in the region?
In the spirit of your compliment on my conciseness, yes.
And do you see escalation a possibility? U.S. military escalation in the region as a possibility?
Well, I can never drive the risk of escalation to zero, but I think that the limited purpose, the partnerships we have in the region, the contributions that we'll seek from others, I think begins to limit that risk.
One last question, since I'm nearly out of time here. General Dempsey, you mentioned earlier that you are concerned about removing Assad from power. Will you elaborate on that? And if so, what's your elaboration?
Well, I still, again, separate from this conversation, which is about the limited purpose of deterring and degrading, I still am cautious about whether we should use U.S. military force in support of the opposition for the purpose of tipping the balance. I think there's other ways we can contribute to that through the development of the moderate opposition. But I remain cautious about taking the opposition's role here in the Civil War.
Thank you, Chairman. Mr. Brian Higgins, New York.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That Bashir al-Assad used chemical weapons, I think, is clear, compelling, and irrefutable. However, I think the fact, experience, and history are all needed here as well. The situation in Syria is that of a national civil war, an ethnic and sectarian conflict that America cannot solve and should not try to. This is not a fight for freedom and democracy. There's no democracy movement in Syria. There's no unifying vision or social contract, not a constitution, or even a preamble of what Syria wants to become. This is nothing more than a fight for control between two sectarian factions, an Alawite faction, or a militia, with air power, supported by the Assad regime, in a mix of Islamic militias, estimated to be about 1,000, with no air power. This is a conflict between a brutal and murderous dictator and an opposition whose best fighters are represented by al-Qaeda affiliates and Islamic extremists bent on creating an Islamist state in Syria. There are no good options, military options for the United States in Syria. The lesson in Syria, as in Iraq and Afghanistan, is that civil wars have to be fought internally, and that political reconciliation cannot come from without, it has to come from within. And that can't be imposed by outside influences. We know that from our own history. The Syrian civil war has caused 100,000 deaths in a country of 23 million. The American Civil War caused 675,000 deaths from a young nation of 34 million people. After spending $2 trillion in Iraq and Afghanistan, representing $40,000 in debt for every American family, the loss of 6,668 American lives, and the physical and mental destruction of tens of thousands of more young Americans. Iraq is as violent today as any time in its history, and Afghanistan is as poor and as corrupt as the It's always been. The American people are sick and tired of war. It's time to nation build in America and invest in the growth of the American economy. Bashar al-Assad used chemical weapons on his own people, and that is morally reprehensible for certain. He should be condemned universally by the international community, and stiff sanctions should be imposed. He should be indicted as a war criminal in the International Tribunal for his murderous deeds. Unfortunately, the use of chemical weapons in this part of the world is not new. Saddam Hussein used them in the Iraq-Iran war between 1983 and 1988, and again against his own civilian population in northern Iraq in 1991. Unfortunately, the stockpiling and use of mustard gas and sarin, thousands of tons of chemical weapons, is all too common.
Facebook and so forth, who organized a revolution. It wasn't the Muslim Brotherhood. It had nothing to do with religion. It had to do with a generational revolution of people looking for their freedom, their opportunity, and their aspirations to be met. Same thing happened in Syria. And in Syria, that opposition was met with violence by Assad. And so that is what has happened here. Now, the moderate opposition is in fact committed to democracy. It's committed to protection of all minority rights, to inclusivity. They want an election in the future of Syria. So I don't want to have a debate about that, because this is not about regime change. This is about the enforcement of the standard with respect to chemical weapons. That's what this is about.
We're going to get a man.
The President is asking for limited authority to enforce that standard, not to deal with all those other issues.
Matt Salmon of Arizona, Chairman of the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee.
Thank you. Secretary Kerry, let me first congratulate the President on bringing this matter to the Congress, as I believe he is constitutionally required to do. I, for one, am very happy that he's chosen to do this. He said just this morning that he didn't draw a red line, the world did, with the ratification of the Chemical Weapons Convention Treaty. Yet, where's the rest of the world in the response? Why are we looking at a near go-alone military mission? You said in your testimony that there are 34 countries who are with us. What degree are they with us, and who are they specifically?
I don't have the full list of them here, but I've listed a bunch of them. The Arab League countries have condemned this. A number of them have asked to be part of a military operation. The Turks, a NATO country, have condemned it, pinned it on Assad, asked to be part of an operation. The French have volunteered to be part of an operation. There are others who have volunteered, but frankly, and I'll let General Dempsey speak to this, we got more volunteers than we can use for this kind of an operation. Now, in the next days, those names, as they choose to, as this evidence comes out, will be made more public. But as I said to you, we have 53 countries have already condemned the use publicly. 37 have said so publicly. And there are, I think it's a total of 34 countries or organizations have indicated that they're prepared to take action. Now that is growing. There are more countries reviewing the evidence that we've shown. And as I said, over this time, the President has purposefully taken to come to Congress. He has asked me and the State Department to reach out to more countries and to build the kind of international support that this merits, and we will do so.
Thank you. I would really appreciate it if we could get a list of the countries and what assets they're willing to commit.
We have it all broken down, I don't...
Not now. We can get that later. I do have a question for General Dempsey. General Dempsey, what are our goals in a military strike? The President said that the military attack would be limited in duration and scope and degrade the Assad regime's capacity to carry out future attacks on its own people. Do you believe that the use of surgical strikes will achieve the President's stated goal? And can you guarantee the American people that the Assad regime will be unable to launch any further chemical warfare attacks both at home or against their neighbors after the U.S. mission is complete? And in addition, do you believe that the region will be more stable after a U.S. attack or less stable?
The mission given to me was to prepare options to attack, to deter and degrade, and that would mean targets directly linked to the control of chemical weapons, but without exposing those chemical weapons to a loss of security. Secondly, the means of delivery, and third, those things that the regime uses, for example, air defense, long-range missiles and rockets, in order to protect those chemical weapons, or in some cases deliver them. So that target package is still being refined as I sit here with you. As far as whether it will be effective, given the limited objectives I've received, the answer is yes. I believe we can make the military strike effective. As in terms of what it will do to the region, that clearly will depend on the reaction of the Assad regime. But as I mentioned earlier, our partners and the United States military is postured to deter his retaliation.
Finally, General Dempsey, as we've been discussing this over the last few weeks, we've given pretty clear, we telegraphed our message to Assad and his regime that we are planning to make an attack. Do you not assume that they might circle those wagons with civilians and that the possibility of civilian casualties could be very great?
Well, the targeting requirements, actually, as given to me by the President, require us to achieve a collateral damage estimate of low. And though they are, in fact, moving resources around and, in some cases, placing prisoners and others in places that they believe we might target, at this point our intelligence is keeping up with that movement.
Karen Bass of California.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman and Ranking Member, for holding this hearing today, and also for our witnesses for coming. I have three questions. I'd like to get out all three questions and then ask whoever chooses to respond. The first one, as I recall, in Libya, the Arab League asked us to intervene. If I'm wrong, correct me, but I wanted to know what was different this time. I know they've condemned the attacks, but why haven't they asked us to intervene? And then, second, what type of retaliation, if any, do you expect from Syria, from Iran, Hezbollah, or other affiliated parties if we move ahead with this strike? And what are we doing to prepare for any possible retaliation? And then finally, as I understand, Putin made some comments today that he might be open to the idea of responding if it could be proven where the chemical weapons came from. And I was wondering if you thought that this provided an opportunity, one, how you might interpret his comments, but also, is there still an opportunity for the international community to come together through multilateral bodies like the UN or NATO? Those are my questions to whichever one of you chooses to answer.
I moved in the military long ago. I've never been a volunteer, but I've just been tasked. I'll answer the one that actually most applies to my particular expertise, and that is what kind of risk of retaliation. There's both conventional risks, that would be if he chose to use some of his long-range rockets to attack his neighbors or some of our facilities. There's also asymmetric. He could encourage some of the surrogates and proxies, such as Lebanese Hezbollah, to attack an embassy. There's actions he could probably seek to achieve in cyber. And we are alert to all of the possibilities, and our mitigating strategy is in the way we've positioned ourselves in the region.
Thank you. Asked about the Arab League, and then the other one was about Putin.
And the Arab League question?
The Arab League question was, as I recall during Libya, I believe that the Arab League asked us to intervene. And I wanted to know what the difference was with Syria. So they've condemned the attack, but they have not asked us to intervene, and why?
The reason is that a couple of their members, a number of their members, 3 or 4 of them, are not in favor of it, so they didn't, they did a consensus statement. But individual countries are prepared to and are in favor of it, and I've named a number of them. But Lebanon, for obvious reasons, has some problems. Algeria, Iraq have some issues. Iraq, for obvious reasons. So you can understand why people might be a little restrained. Let me just share, because this has been a recurring theme here today. Australia. Foreign Minister Carr said that Australia supports the U.S. position on Syria and its right to take actions to enforce vital international norms. And he noted that Australia believes the United States has this right independent of any endorsement by the UN Security Council. Albania. The Albanian ministry said, we're ready to politically support the U.S. and NATO in any action needed to be undertaken to put an end to the massacre of the Syrian population and to support the Syrian opposition in building a free and democratic Syria. Bosnia-Herzegovina.
Before I run out of time, could you respond about Putin? Did he, how you interpret what his comments were today?
I would interpret his comments today as hopeful that perhaps at the G20, he and the president will have a good conversation, and there may be a road forward where Russia would consider not blocking action. But I just quickly say to everybody here, Canada, Stephen Harper has said we should take action. Denmark, France, Poland, Turkey, all have suggested the United States should take action. They'd be prepared to take action with us and so forth. This is a building response, and I think other countries understand the moment.
Thank you.
It's not a building response.
We're going to go now to Mr. Tom Marino of Pennsylvania. Thank you, Chairman. Secretary Hagel, if you could tell me or tell us who are the bad guys, or maybe put it this way, who are our allies? Who are the good guys over there in Syria?
You're referring to the opposition, I assume.
But who are they?
Well, we have covered some of this ground, but again, you're looking at various groups that are part of the opposition. As Secretary Kerry noted, under General Idris, there are groups who, in fact, have one motive and one objective, and that is a free and inclusive Syria.
Do you implicitly trust these people?
Well, that's not my business to trust
Well, certainly it has to be the business, because you're making decisions to go into war and put American lives at risk. So it's a simple concept. You either trust or do not trust. And if you do not trust, we don't call these people our allies or support.
Congressman, every nation, every individual, every group responds in their own self-interest. We're not unaware of all the different groups' self-interest.
Excuse me, sir, with all due respect, I think we are aware. If we look back what happened in Libya, if we look what happened in the Middle East in the past, if we look at the Muslim Brotherhood, if we look at Al-Qaeda, we have to take this into consideration, but obviously we do not know yet who the good guys are. So that
Congressman, let me respond to that.
Okay,
Because the focus is not on good guys, bad guys. The focus is on a narrowly drafted resolution asking authorization from the Congress.
I wouldn't think good guys would be using the gas. I wouldn't think the good guys would be using the gas. And Secretary Kerry, if I may ask you, for argument's sake, as one prosecutor to another, I believe you're beyond a reasonable doubt assertion. I truly believe that. But this will not stop the butchering and the killing that takes place over there. So what is the purpose? What is the end game here? Where is the imminent danger to the United States?
Congressman, you're absolutely correct that it will not stop.
the butchery. I wish it would. But what it will do is what it is intended to do. It is intended to assert the principle, which has been in place since 1925, that no one should use chemical weapons under any circumstances.
But I understand that.
Right.
I understand. What is the reality of this? What is the reality of this? We have seen this use in the past. You made the comment in 2002 when Bush wanted to go into Iraq, which I did agree with, and the president also made the statements when he, I think was in the Senate, in the state, but at least was advancing his career, that we should not do this, even though Saddam Hussein gassed his own people, the Kurds. Now, what is the difference now, today, that you and the president are so intent in going into Syria because Assad has done this?
Well, the gassing was not the pretext for that operation, but ultimately Saddam Hussein was held accountable for not just that crime, but all of his other crimes. And he hung. So the bottom line is he was held accountable.
In hindsight, I can see in hindsight, Joe, you're stating that, but you weren't supporting that in 2002 like you are supporting it now. And there's no, I don't see the difference. My issue is, really gets to this. Who's going to pay for this? And what is it going to cost the United States taxpayers?
I'm going to let Secretary address the cost issue for the military.
Please.
Congressman, we have looked at the different costs, depending on the different options, depending on the decision the president makes. We have given some ranges of this. It would be in the tens of millions of dollars, that kind of range.
Okay, that answers my question, and I see my time is running out here. But believe this, regardless of the minimization of intervention, an American military personnel will die. This I cannot accept. Soldiers coming home deformed and limbless, and even in a body bag, is not acceptable to me, and therefore I cannot and will not vote for this intervention in Syria. Thank you.
Well, this specifically notes that no boots will be on the ground, this resolution that is being drafted. I might remind the Congress.
I will go now to Mr. William Keating of Massachusetts.
And thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all three of you gentlemen for your service to our country. And I want to thank all of you for sharing the information that you have thus far with Congress and the American public, as well as the world. And I think clearly that anyone looking at this evenly, that it's been a success in terms of making clear the case there were chemical weapons used, and the Assad government indeed used them. And I want to congratulate you and the President on those efforts. So General Dempsey doesn't run out of time in a few seconds to answer. We were going down a road that I just wanted to pursue, if I could. General, you raised concerns in the past about engaging militarily in the Syrian conflict. And obviously you're here today to support a limited military action. But, you did started saying in your remarks there are military outcomes in supporting the opposition. But you qualified it saying that's not what we're doing here. But I'm concerned that regardless of our stated intent in this area, others won't share that same view. It's not our intent. So if you could, I'm giving you plenty of time, I hope. Can you just expand upon what your concerns were and maybe are that you had in the past that you stated, so we have a better understanding of what they are, and giving you enough time too to see how what your views might be on how we can mitigate that or navigate around those concerns in the situation we are right now.
Yeah, I want to separate support for the opposition from acting in a limited, focused way to deter and degrade the Assad regime from use of chemical weapons, because the former, the support for the opposition, does come with some risk of the slippery slope of not entirely understanding when that support ends and how much it has to grow over time, which is why I'm mostly supportive of helping the opposition by their development, by their training and equipping, not by becoming their military arm. Okay, now separate that from what we're here for today. In my view, militarily, the fact that the Assad regime has increased its use of chemicals over time to the point where initially it was a weapon intended to terrorize a small portion of a particular neighborhood, to send a message to the opposition, to where now, in the most recent case, it was used to literally attempt to clear a neighborhood. They've reached the point now where Assad is using chemical weapons as just another military tool in his arsenal. That runs great risk for Syria, it runs risk in the region, it runs risk in the globe. And I'm able to, with some integrity, with a lot of integrity I hope, be able to come here before you today and make that distinction, that we should do something in our national interest based on the use of chemical weapons without committing to supporting the opposition to overthrow the regime.
Was part of that slippery slope, General, was that partly a concern about how other countries or how other factions could be taking our actions? Because in a limited sense, we are helping the opposition because we're attacking the Assad government. So, I mean, in that respect, was that any concern you had prior to that, and how do you mitigate that now?
Well, we've always considered not only what effect our actions would have on our partners in the region, the Turks, the Jordanians, the Israelis, and even the Iraqis for that matter, with what impact it would have potentially on our potential adversaries. And so, yeah, of course, that's always been a concern, but a concern and a consideration. But when something reaches the level where I think it has a direct impact on our national security, and the overriding consideration is not what others think, but what we think.
Thank you, General. Very quickly, a ranking member in Europe and your age and emerging threats there. NATO. There was a precedent said in 1999 where NATO did move without UN Security Council approval. Do you think there's hope for them moving, not just individually as countries? Have you exhausted everything in terms of trying to get NATO support as an organization? Ask your secretary that question.
Apologize, I was just reading a note from them. Could you repeat that?
Oh, it was about NATO, the 1999 precedent, where they moved forward without that Security Council approval. Is there any hope in doing that organizationally going forward?
I doubt it, but I can't tell you until I have the meeting that we're slated to have this weekend. I'll get a better sense of that. I would say to Congressman Marino, with respect to the body bags and the specter that he drew, we had, I think it was about a 28-day campaign, maybe 30-day campaign in Kosovo, Bosnia. There were over 30,000 sorties of our aircraft and so forth, none of which is contemplated here, none of which, there were zero casualties. Zero. So,
we should go to Jeff Duncan of South Carolina at this time. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I can't discuss the possibility of U.S. involvement in Syria's civil war without also talking about Benghazi. The administration has a serious credibility issue with the American people due to the unanswered questions surrounding the terrorist attack in Benghazi almost a year ago. When you factor in the IRS targeting of conservative groups, the AP and James Rosen issues, Fast and Furious, and NSA spying programs, bottom line is that there's a need for accountability and trust building from the administration. To paraphrase Friedrich Nietzsche, he said, "I'm not upset over you not telling me the truth. I'm upset because from now on I can't believe you." The administration has a credibility issue. In my opinion, Secretaries Kerry and Hagel, Benghazi is germane to the discussions in Syria because As you stated, Mr. Secretary, the world was and is watching for our response, but after almost a year of not bringing anyone to justice in Benghazi, they are watching our response. Mr. Kerry, your predecessor asked, what difference does it make now? Well, this is the difference, Mr. Secretary. These issues call into question the accountability of this administration, its commitment to the personnel on the ground, and the judgment that it uses when making these determinations. The American people deserve answers before we move forward talking about military involvement in Syria. Section 4 of your testimony today said this is about accountability. Sure it is. The American people deserve answers about Benghazi before we move forward with military involvement in Syria's civil war. This is a picture. You're not be able to see it from there. You might be able to see it on the screen, but this is a picture of Tyrone Woods given to me by his father, Charles Woods, a Navy SEAL. The Woods family deserve answers. He was killed in Benghazi. America deserves answers. Before we send another man or woman the caliber of Ty Woods into harm's way, especially in another country's civil war, especially when there's no clear indication that there's an imminent threat to the United States. I don't question that chemical weapons were used in Syria. I've looked at the classified briefings. I do ask that, if so, where are the other signatory countries of the Chemical Weapons Convention as the U.S. beats the drums of war against this regime in Syria? I have spoken to hundreds of constituents. This represents about 300 emails that my office has gotten, and not a one member in my district in South Carolina, or the emails of people that have contacted my office say, go to Syria and fight this regime. To a letter, they say no, do not go into Syria. Don't get involved in their civil war. I spoke to 8th graders, about 150 8th graders yesterday. They get it. They get it that we shouldn't be drug into someone else's civil war where there are no good guys. There are no good guys to get behind here, and I can only envision an escalation of this current conflict. The same administration that was seemingly so quick to involve the U.S. in Syria now was reluctant to use the same resources at its disposal to attempt to rescue the 4 brave Americans that fought for their lives in Benghazi. Mr. Kerry, you have never been one that has advocated for anything other than caution when involving U.S. forces in past conflicts. The same is true for the President and the Vice President. Is the power of the executive branch so intoxicating that you would abandon past caution in favor of pulling the trigger on a military response so quickly? The reason that I say Benghazi is germane to our discussions on Syria is this. Secretary Kerry, have there been any efforts on the part of the United States, directly or indirectly, to provide weapons to the Syrian rebels, and that would also include facilitating the transfer of weapons from Libyan rebels to the Syrian rebels?
Have there been efforts to
put weapons in the hands of Syrian rebels and also transfer weapons from Libya to Syria?
Well, let me begin, Congressman, by challenging your proposition that I've never done anything except advocate caution because I volunteered to fight for my country, and that wasn't a cautious thing to do when I did it.
Mr. Secretary,
secondly, when I was in the Senate, I'm going to finish, Congressman. I am going to finish. When I was in the United States Senate, I supported military action in any number of occasions, including Grenada, Panama. I can run a list of them. And I am not going to sit here and be told by you that I don't have a sense of what the judgment is with respect to this. We're talking about people being killed by gas, and you want to go talk about Benghazi and Fast and Furious.
Absolutely want to talk about Benghazi. 4 Americans lost their lives. I have sympathy for the people in Syria, and I do think there should be a worldwide response, but we should act cautiously. Before we act
we are acting cautiously. We are acting so cautiously that the President of the United States was accused of not acting because he wanted to have sufficient evidence and he wanted to build the case properly.
It's been 15 days.
Congressman,
we go now to
Mr. Chairman, point of privilege here. This is important. I think this is important. I think it is important whether or not we're going into Syria in a way that the Congressman describes, which I think most people in America don't want us to do. We don't want to do that. That's why the President has said, no boots on the ground. This is not about getting into Syria's civil war. This is about enforcing the principle that people shouldn't be allowed to gas their citizens with impunity. And if we don't vote to do this, Assad will interpret from you that he's free to go and do this any day he wants to. That's what this is about, not getting involved in Syria's civil war. So let's draw the proper distinction here, Congressman. We don't deserve to drag this into yet another Benghazi discussion when the real issue here is whether or not the Congress is going to stand up for international norms with respect to dictators that have only been broken twice until Assad, Hitler and Saddam Hussein. And if we give license to somebody to continue that, shame on us.
We'll go now to Mr. David Cicilline of Rhode Island.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the ranking member for convening this hearing. And I want to begin by thanking our three witnesses, not only for being here today, but for your extraordinary service to our country. I want to acknowledge and thank the President for his consultation. I've had the opportunity to participate in the classified briefing on Sunday, review some documents, briefing on the telephone on Monday with Secretaries Kerry, Hagel, Jim Clapper, and others, Ambassador Rice. I really thank the President for this ongoing consultation and sharing of information. This is, I think, a very difficult question, and there are, as Secretary Hagel said, no good answers. The use of chemical weapons is horrific. I think there is ample evidence that the Assad regime is responsible for that and should be held accountable. And my question really is, as I talk to constituents in my district who react the same way, this war weariness and a recognition of all of the enormous risks associated with military intervention, both in propping up the wrong opposition and loss of life and being deeply engaged in civil war and the spiraling of that. They all wonder, is there a set of actions we could take which would evidence strong condemnation, isolate Assad, and also vindicate our deep commitment to a set of international institutions and organizations. So things like making China and Russia act in the Security Council on a public stage to veto a resolution, attempt to seek an indictment of Assad for war crimes, isolate Syria in ways through sanctions and other kinds of international actions where we might build a broad coalition, strongly condemn the use of chemical weapons, isolate Syria, and help build this sort of international voice, and do it in a way, frankly, that would be more consistent with our values, with the idea of working together with other nations and using international organizations. So I'd like to know, was there a discussion about a set of such options that might be effective without the risks that are associated with military action? Were they considered and rejected, or is it something we could put together that would be a strong, forceful statement and set of actions that would hurt Assad, deter the likely use of chemical weapons again, but without any of the dangers? And then second question quickly is, Mr. Secretary Kerry, you mentioned that America and her allies have ample ways to make Assad regret that decision without going to war. I think we would love to hear more about what those things are, because I think one of our concerns, or many concerns, is what happens after a military attack. But I'm really interested in that first question from all of you as to whether or not we might think hard about other ways to do this that will invite the kind of condemnation that's appropriate.
Congressman, a very good question. Let me just say to you that we wish, believe me, we wish that the international institution that is there for this kind of response was able to respond. And that's the UN and the UN Security Council. As recently as a few weeks ago when this event took place, our representatives at the UN attempted, along with other allies, to put a resolution in front of the Security Council that would have simply condemned the event, not assigning any blame at all, just condemn the use of action. And the Russians said no, they blocked it. So that is what has set us into this path of believing that we have to act in a way that has an effect at deterring Assad from the use of these weapons. Now, even if the UN did pass something, even if you had some sanction, if it isn't meaningful in a way that is going to deter the action, and no one has yet contrived of some, piece of paper or terminology that's going to change this man's calculation with respect to what he's fighting for. So I think the judgment has been made that the only way to have an impact, the only way you're going to hold him accountable now, is to make it clear to him that this will in fact detract from his ability to abuse his people and to use force to stay in power.
I know Secretary Hugo has...
Well, I think what the Secretary said is exactly right. I would add two things. There are a number of tracks that we're on right now to accomplish what you're talking about. Secretary Kerry's diplomatic track, which has been ongoing and intense. Our reaching out to our allies all over the world. I was in Asia last week with 15 defense ministers from all over Asia Pacific, discussing this, meeting with leaders of countries in those areas. Our NATO allies, all three of us have been talking to our counterparts from countries all over the world. What the White House is doing, what the President is doing. So, working through institutions. We're still involved with the United Nations. So those tracks are being run in addition to what we're talking about here. One exact point on the purpose of this hearing. General Dempsey said this morning at the Senate Armed Services Committee, when asked about the violation of the chemical weapons norm, 100-year-old norm. Is it that important? Is it that big a deal? One of the points that General Dempsey made, which is exactly right, and we start here, this is a threat to our interests, to our forces, to our country, allowing a tyrant to continue to get away with the use of chemical weapons. That's a real threat against us.
Adam Kinsinger of Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and gentlemen, thank you. I know you've had a couple of very long weeks. I'm about to support this, but I do want to say at the very beginning, my disapproval of the President's policies in the Middle East, and I believe that part of the reason we're having difficulty rallying an international coalition is because they don't see the United States having led on this until recently. But that said, as a veteran of the military, as a current serving military pilot in the Air National Guard, I also am war-weary, as many Americans are war-weary. But I want to remind Americans of what one of my favorite presidents, Ronald Reagan, said. If we want to avoid war, he said, war begins when governments believe that the price of aggression is cheap. And I think that's a situation we find ourselves in Syria now. In fact, in listening to some of my colleagues, it's been amazing to me that we are seeming to paralyze ourselves into inaction, running through every potential scenario that could occur in this. And it makes me wonder, God help us if we become a country that can't do the right thing because we paralyze ourselves to inaction. What I've got here is a picture that I think everybody needs to see. This is a picture of Syrian children, many of which the Secretary said earlier, about 400 some, died in at least just this one chemical gas attack. And if we don't do anything about this, you can ensure that maybe even the kids in this picture, or definitely other kids, will die from the same attack. I want to very quickly read to you the effects of sarin gas, and I want you to look at these children and understand that children have gone through this. The mild effects of sarin exposure is runny nose, watery burning eyes, small pupils, eye pain, blurred vision, drooling and excessive sweating, cough, chest tightness, rapid breathing, diarrhea, nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain, increased urination, confusion, drowsiness, weakness, headache, slower fast heart rate, lower high blood pressure. Exposure to large doses of sarin, like we saw in Syria, loss of consciousness, convulsions, paralysis, respiratory failure, which is a polite way of saying you suffocate to death while you're aware that you are suffocating to death. What we're talking about is a discussion of what the international community and the United States of America in the goodness of our heart has determined is the right thing in an area that we can affect. Can we ban all artillery shells? We can't. Can we ban all war? We can't. But if we can stand up and say that chemical weapons have no place in this world and we can do something about it, God help us if we don't. And I would remind folks, and I will ask you all to comment on this eventually, from 1991 to 2002 or 2003, we maintained 2 no-fly zones over Iraq under bipartisan administrations because of our disdain for chemical weapons. And most people would have agreed that what we did over northern and southern Iraq was the right thing to do. because Saddam Hussein gassed his own residents. This is not the first time America has put down a red line on chemical weapons. I've heard people say that this is the president's red line. It's not the red line of the United States of America, and you just have to look at history and know that it is. And I'm also reminded of what President Clinton said when he was asked what his one regret was for his time in presidency. He said, "My one regret was inaction in Rwanda." And I wonder in 20, 10, 50 years, what are we going to say if we did nothing about the gassing of thousands of people in Syria? Now, I just have a couple of questions. I've heard some people say, and it's really bothered me, they say that if we go in and we strike Assad and make him pay for the use of chemical weapons more than any benefit he gains, that we are acting as, quote, Al-Qaeda's Air Force. And I believe that is a cheap line by some people to garner headlines and not a serious discussion of what's going on in Syria. So, Mr. Secretary Kerry, if you'll start, what's your thought on the comment of the cheap line of Al-Qaeda's Air Force in dealing with the opposition and in punishing an evil man for using evil weapons?
Well, Congressman, your comments have been very eloquent and I think very, very important to this discussion. And I'm confident I join the General and Secretary Hagel in thanking you for your service. They're willing to serve both in the Guard as well as a pilot, but also here. The intent of the President could not be more clear. And the impact, if Congress will pass this and we can carry out this action, the impact will be not to help Al-Qaeda. In fact, it won't help Al-Qaeda. It will further expose Al-Qaeda, but it will hold the dictator accountable to this critical standard. You just reiterated it, and I said it in my opening testimony. This is not just about folks in Syria, my friends. American troops benefit from this standard being upheld. And through all of our wars since 1925, we've managed to see it upheld against when we've been involved. The fact is that the absence of our willingness to uphold this standard will do several things that are directly against our interests. Number one, completely undermine America's validity, America's credibility, America's word in the region and elsewhere. It will embolden North Korea and embolden Iran with respect to activities that will directly threaten the United States and our allies. It will importantly increase the number of terrorists that we are already concerned about, because it will force people who want to take on Assad to go to the least common denominator of efficiency and expediency, and that will be to arm the worst people who will try to get the job done. And so I would just urge everybody to listen carefully to Congressman Kinzinger, but to really evaluate this just on a fundamental basis of common sense and human behavior. In the absence of doing this, there will be a grant of impunity to Bashar al-Assad for the use of these weapons. Alan Grayson from Florida.
Thank you. General Dempsey, do Syria and Hezbollah have the means to launch a counterattack against U.S. vessels in the Mediterranean, the U.S. Embassy in Beirut, and Israel?
Our maritime assets are positioned such that there are no capabilities that can threaten them. Embassies, of course, are a fixed resource and are always subject to terrorist attack. That remains true today as it has for the last 10 years, and we've taken steps to mitigate that risk.
And Israel?
Israel, you may be aware, is actually anticipating some action, gone to a state of high alert, called reserves up, taken a lot of measures. And by the way, we partner with Israel very closely on the defense of Israel.
Would you say that a counterattack is more likely than not?
No, I don't think I can say that. Actually, but without signaling the Syrian regime in some way, I wouldn't say that. I wouldn't come to that conclusion.
Secretary Kerry, have members of the Syrian opposition called for such an attack? And if so, whom?
Not specifically that I know of. Have they? They support it apparently, but they've not advocated to me. I've had conversations with the president of the opposition, and there was no pleading or urging to do this.
In fact, haven't members of the Syrian opposition said they don't want an attack? Isn't that true?
No, I have not heard that.
You haven't seen the public reports to that effect? All right, Secretary Kerry, there are 189 signers of the Chemical Weapons Convention. Syria does not happen to be one of them. How many of those signatories have pledged to participate in the military intervention in Syria, and what exactly has each one pledged to do?
There are at least 10 countries that have pledged to participate. We have actually not sought more for participation. We have sought people for support. And there are many more, obviously, that support. But I think I should let the general speak the question. I said earlier, there really is a limit for this kind of an operation as to how many you want to participate. You want support, but just physically, the management of it, the technical capacity and other issues are critical. And General, perhaps you want to say something?
Actually, Congressman, I apologize. I was writing down your first question. What was the question about partners?
Of the 189 signatories to the Chemical Weapons Convention,
Right.
How many of them have pledged to participate in a military attack on Syria, and what have they pledged to do?
Well, I don't have the final answer to that question. Commander U.S. CENTCOM is actually militarily conducting most of the outreach. And we have agreement to assist in many different ways, some of which wouldn't be appropriate to speak about in an unclassified setting.
Secretary Hagel, will the military action in Syria, if it does take place, require a supplemental appropriation? And if you think not, then will you commit to that now?
Well, it depends on the option that the President would select. I have said that we will work with the Congress on whatever the cost of that is. Thank you.
Secretary Hagel, there's been a report in the media that the administration has mischaracterized post-attack Syrian military communications, and that these communications actually express surprise about the attack. This is a very serious charge. Can you please release the original transcripts so that the American people can make their own judgment about that important issue?
What transcripts are you referring to?
The transcripts that were reported that took place after the attack, in which the government has suggested that they confirmed the existence of an attack, but actually it's been reported that Syrian commanders expressed surprise about the attack having taken place, not confirmed it.
Well, that's probably classified. Congressman, I'd have to go back and review exactly what you're referring to.
Well, you will agree that it's important that the administration not mislead the public in any way about these reports, won't you?
Well, of course, but I'm not aware of the administration misleading the American public on this issue or any other issue.
Will you agree that the only way to put that matter to rest is to release the original reports in some redacted form?
Well, I'm not going to agree to anything until I see it, until I understand better what it is, but most likely it's classified.
I understand that. I'm asking, will you declassify it for this purpose?
I just gave you my answer. I have no idea what exactly you're talking about. I'd have to go back and look at it. I'd have to confer with others, our intelligence community. That's all I can tell you now. Thank you.
Tom Cotton of Arkansas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Kerry, Mr. Hagel, General Dempsey. Thank you for your time and your service, most importantly, in uniform. Mr. Kerry, Mr. Hagel as young men, General Dempsey as a young man, and now as a more seasoned man as well. I have grown weary for several months, not weary of war, because I know, as each of you know, that war is sometimes the price that a free society must pay to defend our freedom and to protect our interests abroad. I have grown weary of the President's war weariness. I have called for months for action in Syria. I feel that action should have been taken years ago. I'm deeply worried that our core national security interests are at stake in Syria. Mr. Kerry, you said that the president does not bluff. I fear that both our enemies and our allies do not believe that statement. For some time now, we have let Iran violate numerous United Nations resolutions. In Syria, we have not acted previously on uses of chemical weapons. And I do believe the world is watching. And the day the United States does not act is not just the day that Bashar al-Assad knows it's open season for chemical weapons, but also the day Kim Jong-un knows that, and most ominously, the day that Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei spins his centrifuges into overdrive, which starts the clock ticking to the less than 2-year moment when those nuclear warheads on intercontinental missiles could hit our constituents here in the United States. I agree with what my colleague Adam Kinzinger said, that we have a vital interest in maintaining the international taboo against chemical weapons. All of you, like me, have been in training, I suspect, where you've been exposed to gas, and you know that no one benefits from that taboo more than do American troops. And I'm also deeply worried that our inaction is destabilizing the Middle East, in particular, our allies in Israel and Jordan, as well as Turkey, and emboldening Iran, one of our most implacable enemies, as they send thousands of troops to fight in Syria, along with Hezbollah, its terrorist proxy from Lebanon. So that is why, miracle of miracles, I am in support of the President's call for action in Syria. I'm urging my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support this action as well. However, the President's stated policy was not just a red line against chemical weapons, which, as Mr. Sherman said, occurred without any objection from members of Congress and occurred before he was reelected by the American people. It was also a stated policy of regime change. So I would like to ask you, what is the President planning that could lead not just to punishment for this use of chemical weapons, but also an ultimate victory in Syria, which is a change in the nature of the regime, so they will not use chemical weapons again, and so that a pro-Western, moderate, native Syrian government can take its place?
Well, Congressman, thank you for a very clear and compelling statement, and thank you for the support for the President's initiative for the interests of the country. With respect to the longer term, you're absolutely correct, but I want to separate here. This is very important in terms of what the President is asking the Congress for. Yes, the President's policy is that Assad must go and there should be a regime change, and the President is committed to additional efforts in support of the opposition, together with friends and allies in the region, in a coordinated way in order to achieve that, with the understanding that the ultimate transition will come and can come through a negotiated settlement, a political resolution, not a military. He doesn't believe that, we don't believe there's a military solution. But this action, because nobody should be confused, Americans should not be confused, and I said earlier, this is not an effort to take over Syria's civil war. It is an effort to uphold this standard. And the action the President is asking the Congress to approve is a singular military action to uphold that standard with respect to chemical weapons. On a separate track is the political track, which the President is seeking support for through appropriate channels here in Congress, which is in effect now, to help the opposition in order to ultimately see Assad leave. But we don't want to confuse the two in the context. Is there a downstream collateral benefit to what will happen in terms of the enforcement of the chemical weapons effort? The answer is yes. It will degrade his military capacity. It will, for sure, have downstream impact. But that is not the primary calculation of what brings us here, and nobody should confuse the two in this effort.
We're going to...
What I'd like to do, Congressman, is really in classified session, we should have the discussion about the other things the President would like to see us do to support the opposition.
Thank you. Ron Vargas of California. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Secretaries, for being here in general. First of all, I'd like to say before I ask an embarrassing question, I have the greatest respect for all of you. I think Secretary of State Kerry, I think I first heard of you from Dan Berrigan back in 1985 when I was in the Jesuits at the Jesuit House, and he had great respect for you because of your activities after Vietnam. And I know that Secretary Hagel, that you were so reluctant going to war that you almost weren't approved by the Senate. In fact, I think you were the only secretary ever to be filibustered, so I know you're not anxiously running to war, and the President, of course, ran on not getting us into war. And I'm certainly someone who's very reluctant to get into any kind of war like this. On Saturday, however, I had the opportunity to speak to a small group of veterans in my district in San Diego before I flew here for the classified briefing on Sunday, and they asked a question I told them I would ask. I first told them I wouldn't, but then they convinced me that it was a good question, and that is that one of them has a son in the military today, and he believes that last time we went running off to war that the facts that were given were lies or misleading. And what he wanted is just one thing, and I told him that all I had read, and certainly now all that I have read, does lead me to believe that chemical weapons were used and that children were gassed, and because of that we do have to act. But he wanted you to promise that the facts that you've given us are true to the best of your ability, that you're not lying, that you're not holding anything back, that what we've seen, what I've read, and I've read everything that they've given to us. I've been back twice now to make sure that I've read everything. I want to make sure that you promise us that you're telling the truth.
Congressman, I am proud and perfectly willing to tell you that everything that I've said is the truth and based on the information as it's been presented to me, and as I have, based on my own experience in war, which I resolved to do if I ever was in a position to make any choices in the future, fully vetted, and I'm comfortable with it. And I wouldn't possibly make this recommendation if I weren't comfortable with it. So I believe we have vetted this, we've double-checked it, we've asked the intel people to re-scrub, we've even had a separate team created that had independent from the original to totally vet, check all the analysis, find out if it could have been an opposition or anything else. And in every case, I would say for myself, and everybody that we have sat around a table with, there is a comfort level with this that is rare in this kind of situation. I wouldn't have said you could prove this case beyond a reasonable doubt if I didn't believe it.
Thank you. Secretary Hagel, again, I apologize for the insulting question. I think it has to be asked.
No, I think it's a very important question. We ought to ask more questions like that. I don't know how I would improve on my former Senate colleague's question and answer back to you.
What you done?
I feel exactly the same way. I know that the three of us wouldn't be sitting here today saying the things we're saying if we didn't absolutely believe it. We've all three been through too much, and our experiences guide us. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I still have a lot of time left, but that was my only question. Thank you.
What about that big TV?
Thank you. We're going to go now to Mr. George Holding of South Carolina.
North Carolina, Mr. Chairman.
Over North Carolina.
That's all right.
Of course.
That's all right. We still like South Carolina. General Dempsey, thank you very much for your service. I appreciate the fact and that we have a chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff that also has a master's degree in literature, Irish literature at that. The objectives of this military action that have been stated is to hold accountable, degradability, and deter future action. And the associated targeting with those objectives. Would this military action, militarily speaking, from your perspective, constitute war?
I could buy them real cheap, Robert, that'd be good.
Well, as you know, Congressman, the decision on whether something rises to the level of war is actually one that's made collaboratively between the Commander-in-Chief and the Congress of the United States. I think militarily, it's hard. It would be hard for me to say that this is other than an active war. But the problem with that characterization is that war has this image of being a campaign over an extended, protracted period of time until someone plants a flag or someone surrenders. And I want to make it clear, that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about something very limited to address the specific issue of the use of chemical weapons.
If we take these actions, trying to achieve the objectives that you stated, and the Syrians punch back, that escalation,
Next thing I want you to do,
I'm sure we can degrade their ability to punch back. I'm sure that you have planned for contingencies of them punching back, but there is always the chance that they can punch back and it can hurt.
Work from the top down to the kiln.
I think about the British in the Falklands, and they had tremendous overpowering strength, and all of a sudden they found that there were some weaknesses there. There was hole in defenses, and they lost a capital ship. And that could happen to us. If the Syrians punch back and are successful, would that be closer to a definition of war?
That package was the
Well, I'm not sure that their reaction to our action and our reaction to that, this gets into a cycle. And again, it's not the chairman of the Joint Chiefs that defines or declares war. But if you're asking me, are we prepared for retaliation, we are as well prepared as we possibly could be.
So certainly we're prepared for any retaliation, and if there was retaliation, we would have to answer that immediately.
I don't, Congressman, I wouldn't make that conclusion. I think there's no automaticity to anything in conflict, at least from my perspective. I think that we would certainly have the ability to control our response on our terms. So I wouldn't conclude that this resolution starts a process that you or the President lose control of.
Military speaking, is Russia still a superpower?
I think the answer to that question is when you look at the instruments of power, look at ourselves. So it's a combination of military, diplomatic, and economic power that defines us as a quote-unquote superpower. I think that Russia still possesses elements that would qualify them to join the club of superpowers. They still have an incredible strategic arsenal, but conventionally, I wouldn't put them in that class. And so I think there's parts of their apparatus that rise to that level.
Obviously, we all know that Syria and Russia are close allies. Syria is Russia's last ally in the Middle East. Syria has the only Russian military base outside of Russia. If Russia decided to strike at us in that theater, what are the top 3 options that they would have to strike us in retaliation for us striking their closest ally?
Congressman, I'm going to suggest that it wouldn't be helpful in this setting to have a discussion about that kind of hypothetical, but I do have some views about it that I could share in a classified environment.
But we can certainly say that Russia would have options to strike us in that theater in retaliation for us striking.
Russia has capabilities that range from the asymmetric, including cyber, all the way up through strategic nuclear weapons. And again, it wouldn't be helpful in this setting to speculate about that.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Brad Snyder of Illinois.
Thank you, and I want to thank you all again, first, of course, for the service to our country, but also for the time you spent with us today, as well as Ambassador Ford for the time you spent with us earlier in the year. This is, without a doubt, the biggest decision one of the biggest decisions we can possibly make, and one I think we all take very seriously. It's why I came Sunday for the classified briefing. I've read the classified report. I have listened in on the teleconference we had on Monday, and I'm grateful to have the time with you here. I also recognize the angst of my constituents, of the country, as there is a worry and a legitimate concern. But Secretary Kerry, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you said, if we do nothing, the likelihood of Assad using chemical weapons again is, I will say, approaching 100%. Is that fair? Fair. And with that, I want to turn, I'm sorry, to General Dempsey, because you said in escalation, you can't get the risk of escalation down to zero. But I wonder if there's a risk of escalation if we do nothing.
There is absolutely a risk of escalation in the use of chemical weapons if we do nothing.
And if that approaches 100%, if we do stand down now, is there a likelihood that we're back at this same question again a month or 6 months from now at a higher level with a greater risk?
I believe so. I think so.
That's why we should have a discussion.
So as I evaluate the decision we have to make, the first thing I wanted to see was the evidence, and I think without a doubt, as you've said, beyond any reasonable doubt, the Assad regime has planned, perpetrated, and even tried to cover up this massive use of chemical weapons, weapons of mass destruction. One of my questions was a question of national interest, and General Dempsey, you've said without a doubt, for our soldiers, for here at home, and our interests around the world, this is a threat to our national interests. Is that fair as we go through the decision process?
It is, because of the essentially establishing it's an overused phrase, but a new norm. And I haven't lived in a world where militarily chemical weapons were routinely used, and I don't want to live in that world.
From an international standpoint, I guess I come to, if we have the interest in our national interest, the authority, clearly I reviewed the Chemical Weapons Convention. The United Nations is the authority here, but Secretary Kerry, you said the United Nations is not available to us. If it was, would we be on a different strategy, or is this all that's left to us?
If the Russians were to join in and be willing to pass this with the Chinese, I guarantee the President would want to see it passed.
I think.
Could I just also, Congressman Holding left a question on the table, and I want to make sure it's not hanging out there. Foreign Minister Lavrov of Russia has made it clear, quote, pretty much quote, paraphrase, Russia does not intend to fight a war over Syria. And I've had personal conversations with President Putin and with the Foreign Minister that have indicated that Syria doesn't rise to that level of potential conflict. And so I just don't, their ships are kind of staying out of the way. They're not threatening that, and I don't think that would be what would happen here.
Right, thank you. If the UN is not available to us, the international community is rising up, and I want to thank you for reaching out to them and bringing in the coalition. If we don't lead, is there anyone else who will lead to hold the Assad regime accountable?
Well, it's conceivable that the French, if others were to join them, might decide, and others in the region might decide, but, we're not putting that to the test because we don't believe that that's appropriate.
Okay. As we look forward, and Mr. Cicilline touched on this, the other options on the table. You've evaluated, you've seen where we are. This, as I said, is one of the biggest decisions we're going to make. Can you state definitively that the strategy laid out that you're considering will achieve the goals we have to deter and diminish the ability of the Assad regime to use chemical weapons going forward?
Yeah, militarily I can state that we can achieve the goal of deterring and degrading. take note that I didn't say we can prevent. I mean, that's the challenge here. We are trying to change the calculus of the regime.
I understand, and what I believe is that for us to prevent would require isolating, identifying, and putting boots on the ground, which I think uniformly we've said we stand against. All right, thank you. I yield back.
We'll go to Mr. Randy Weber of Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. General Dempsey, these are for you. In your remarks that you submitted to this committee, there was 5 options you laid out: training, assisting, advising and assisting the opposition, conducting limited standoff strikes, establishing a no-fly zone, establishing buffer zones, and number 5, control chemical weapons. Now, I've been through that, and I've studied it, and I'm going to go back through that. Training, advising, and assisting the opposition cost several hundred troops to several thousand, in your words, $500 million annually. Risks that extremists would gain access to additional capabilities. You remember writing that?
I do.
Okay, perfect. You also said risk was retaliatory attacks. You also said insider attacks was a risk, where those troops, the people that we're seeking to help, would actually wind up turning their guns on us and killing our troops. Number 2, you said conduct limited standoff strikes. Your cost was in the billions, especially depending on the duration. You also said, quote, I'm quoting you, regime could withstand limited strikes by dispersing its assets, end quote. It's as if we gave them a 2-week notice. You also said retaliatory attacks were possible, and the probability of collateral damage would impact civilians and foreigners inside the country. Number 3, you said establish a no-fly zone. Your estimate was cost $500 million initially, and averaging as much as $1 billion a month. You said there was a risk of losing a U.S. aircraft, which would then, quote, which would require us to insert personnel recovery forces, end quote, a.k.a. boots on the ground. You also said it may, quote, it may also fail to reduce the violence or shift the momentum because the regime relies overwhelmingly on surface-fired mortars, artillery, and missiles, end quote. In other words, it's not a very good option, I submission. Number 4, you said establish buffer zones. You estimated that at $1 billion a month. Number 5, you said control chemical weapons. Risk, boots on the ground, American women and men, $1 billion a month, which I understand the Secretaries of State and Defense are not advocating that. But I have a simple question for you. Everything I read from your summary indicated to me that there was absolutely no guarantee of a lasting peace in Syria or in the region, and nor that they are American-friendly after we have a gargantuan outlay of American money, resources, and maybe American blood and even lives if they retaliate. Absolutely no guarantee. Would you say that's a fair statement?
I just would remind you, the answer to the letter that I sent to Representative Engel was related to the question that I received, which is what would it take to tip the balance in favor of the opposition and lead to the overthrow of the Assad regime?
Okay.
So I want to make sure we're separate from what we're doing here today.
No, I got that. I appreciate that. I'll direct that to Mr. Hagel. Would you say that's a fair statement? No guarantee of an outcome on the other end?
No guarantee of the outcome
Of a stable, of peace in Syria, peace in the region, and that whoever comes out on the other side will be our friends. No guarantee.
Well, but that's not the stated objective of what we're talking about.
Well, that wasn't my question, sir. My question was, would you guarantee that after trying to establish the objective that you're seeking to establish, we still do not have a guarantee on the other end of a stable Syria, a stable region, and whoever comes out on the other side would be our friends?
Well, I wouldn't guarantee anything. This is, as I believe the last 3 hours have been very clear about, this is unpredictable, it's complicated, it's dangerous. There are many interests that are surging through the Middle East, in particular Syria.
Okay.
What we're thinking through diplomatically, militarily, international coalition, all the other factors that we've talked about today are
Forgive me, but I'm running out of
to
time.
get to one thing, and that's a diplomatic settlement.
Okay. Secretary Kerry, your response, please.
I can't give you a guarantee about the outcome in Syria as a whole, but I can give you a guarantee that the United States of America can make it clear to Assad that it's going to cost him to use chemical weapons, and we can have an impact on deterring and degrading his capacity. That guarantee is what I can give you, and that's what the president's seeking to do.
But at what price, I would add in my last 15 seconds.
Well, not at the price that you described, absolutely not at the price that you
Well, let me just say, if American credibility is at stake here, let there be no mistake. If anybody were to attack us, this Congress, in my view, would authorize the full force and fury of our very capable military.
Congressman, Mr. Chairman, this is important. But Congressman, not everything comes down in terms of threat or potential future, threat to our country to somebody attacking us. Lots of things we do in preparation and as a matter of deterrence, and we also do it in the context, on occasion, as we did in Bosnia, to make peace, to have a settlement, to save lives. That's what we achieved. And so we have achieved that previously, and I believe in the long run it is vital for the United States to assert this principle and to begin to move this troubled part of the world in a different direction. That's what we're working on. Mel Cabrera from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, the witnesses for their patience. Obviously, this has been a long day, it's been a long week, but it is of critical importance that we are having this discussion. I applaud the President for including Congress in this debate. I agree that we have to show resolve, and we have to show that we're committed to our allies, but my constituents and I still need to be convinced, not that atrocities have occurred. We all are unanimous in our condemnation of what Assad has done. But we need to know exactly what our goals are and our objectives, because this is increasingly a complex situation. And to that extent, let me ask Secretary Hagel a question. When I was home in Sacramento County this past weekend, people were stopping me in the grocery stores. My neighbors were pulling me aside on the street. I think all of my colleagues have been inundated with phone calls, emails, and almost unanimously, people don't want us to strike Syria. They're fatigued. And I answer to these people. These are the people that I represent. So my question, Secretary Hagel, is what can I tell my constituents about why these strikes are in our national security interest? Why these strikes matter to these folks that are struggling every day? How do I effectively communicate what our plan is?
I understand your question clearly, and I understand the responsibility you have to give those you represent a clear answer. So that's partly why the President wanted to bring this before the Congress, so the American people would have an opportunity to hear all the questions and get the answers. My answer to you is, for you to give to your constituents, is it's clearly in the interest of our country, because as we have noted here today, the use of chemical weapons, if it becomes a norm, if it becomes a standard, if it becomes an art of war, a method of war that's accepted by the world, which has not been for the last 100 years, it jeopardizes our country, our homeland, our troops, our people all over the world. When you look at the nations that have stockpiles, that one nation in particular, Syria, that we're talking about, has used those. North Korea has them. What about Iran's threat to all of us? So this is in the interest of the United States, aside from the international law.
So listening to those concerns, listening to what the strategic goals are here and why it is in the national security interest, again, listening to my constituents, they understand the importance of maintaining our credibility and our standing as a nation. But again, Syria seems so far away from them. These issues seem very far away from them, and as we discuss it here, we're sending a message to Assad but we're not securing these chemical stockpiles. We're not, and I think General Dempsey, you've, in your testimony in the past, have indicated how difficult it would be to secure chemical stockpiles, to make sure that they don't fall in the hands of terrorists, of individuals who would want to use them against us here on our own homeland, as well as with our allies. If that's not our stated goal, if our stated goal is not to make sure that we're securing our homeland, that we're making sure our neighborhoods are safe, it's a very difficult goal to articulate to my constituents.
Let me just remind us of something which has been noted earlier here in this hearing. Next week we're going to we are going to remember what happened in this country on that September day in 2001, and we all recall where we were. How many of my constituents during those days in Nebraska, or your constituents in California, ever thought about or even knew where Afghanistan was? Or had ever even heard of this organization called Al-Qaeda? There's a clear living example of how we are not insulated from the rest of the world, how things can happen to the United States in this country if we are not vigilant and think through these things and stay ahead of these things and take action to prevent these things from occurring. Maybe something would not happen in this country for a couple of years. I don't know. But it's been noted up here that the next president, the next chairman and ranking, the next group of members who will occupy your seats may have to deal with this in a bigger way if we're not paying attention to it now. But the 9/11 anniversary, I think, is a very clear example you can use with your constituents. Scott Perry, Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, each of you, for your military service. Just like to start out with some corrections for the record, since it's been a topic of discussion. I've got the quote here from the President. A red line for us is we start seeing a whole bunch of chemical weapons moving around or being utilized. That would change my calculus. That would change my equation. That's the President, August 20th of 2012. Just because some folks like to revise history. Ms. Secretary Kerry, if you could, just one question to start out and then a couple more quotes, is would you consider sarin gas a weapon of mass destruction?
Yes.
PX gas, weapon of mass destruction?
Yes.
Okay, so those two were used in Iraq, found in Iraq before I got there, and found in Iraq when I got there, for those who say that the past administration lied about weapons of mass destruction. Now, some quotes here for you. This is from the President. The President does not have the power under the Constitution to unilaterally authorize a military attack in a situation that does not involve stopping an actual or imminent threat to the nation. That was in 2007. If the U.S. goes in and attacks another country without a UN mandate and without clear evidence that can be presented, then there are questions in terms of whether international law supports it. That was August 23rd of 2013. 2013, August 31st. While I believe I have the authority to carry out this military action without specific congressional authorization, I know that the country will be stronger and our actions will be even more effective if the strike is authorized by Congress. Now, Secretary Kerry, you, President Obama, and Vice President Biden have all previously expressed your support for the War Powers Resolution. Section 2C of the statute asserts that the President may constitutionally use U.S. armed forces abroad only pursuant to a declaration of war, specific statutory authorization, a national emergency created by an attack on the United States. We have a credibility and trust issue here. I questioned Ambassador Ford right here in this room in March about our strategy, and I could get no clear answer regarding the crossing of a red line, which I think was a capricious statement based on the lack of the strategy. However, we are here right now with this situation in front of us. My direct question to you, Secretary, is will the President abide by the wishes of the representatives of the American people if there is a no vote on a resolution in this Congress?
Well, I can't, look, I can't answer for the president. He answers for himself, obviously, and I answer to him. But I can guarantee you the president has made it clear that he believes he has the authority within the Constitution, in the executive branch, to be able to take an action without congressional approval, and that has happened again and again under presidencies of both parties. So, I don't think we're going to advantage ourselves with that constitutional debate here right now.
But I think that's pivotal and critical. When we talk about how we're going to do what we're going to do, we haven't talked about enough about
rather than talk about
authority. The president has the authority to do it. And with all due respect, Mr. Secretary, with all the, I'm glad that the president came to Congress to get this question answered and have us involved. He made the statement that he was going before he came to Congress. And then it's my opinion that when the American people said, we don't want you to do this, and when the international community said, we're not with you on this, and British Parliament said no, then he came to the Congress. Not because he had this shining vision in the beginning of a grand strategy which would involve the Congress once the red line was crossed.
Congressman, look, we can have a discussion here. Needless to say, you don't agree with the president's approach to some of these issues over a period of time, maybe many of them, maybe all of them. And you are a member of the other party, and the president isn't your president of choice. He's the president we have. It doesn't do us any good here to debate those differences with the president. What is important is to discuss here whether or not the fact that he has come to you and he is requesting this authority and he has made his decision as president.
Okay, and I would say that's...
So now let's decide whether or not together we can find the common ground in the interests of our country to do what is necessary to hold a man accountable for his use of chemicals, weapons of mass destruction. That's the question.
We have with us Tulsi Gabbard, who flew a long way from Hawaii to be with us today. Tulsi.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. I have a tremendous amount of respect for three of you and your service and commitment to our country on so many levels. I also have the privilege and honor of serving our country in uniform and deployed with the Hawaii Army National Guard to Iraq back in 2005. And one of my daily responsibilities there, serving in a medical unit, was going through a list every single day of every injury and casualty throughout the entire region, looking for and taking care of our Hawaii soldiers. And it is those experiences and those memories, as well as the knowledge of the many innocents who've been killed in Syria that I carry with me every day, but through this discussion that we have and take our responsibility very seriously, as do you. I think there's no question, we've seen it clear today, that the use of these chemical weapons is horrifying. My concerns that I'd like to address with you lie in the fact that the path that you're advocating for us forward still remains unclear to me on many levels. The right course of action, the most effective course of action, and whether or not the stated objectives that you have spoken about today and previously, as well as making sure that we have a very realistic and honest understanding of what the next steps are and what the unintended consequences of this action could be. And that's really where my concern is the answer to the question of what happens next. I think that we can place many limitations on what role the United States will play, both through resolutions and in other means. But whether we like it or not, the consequences of our actions will impact the Civil War, a very complicated region, and once we are involved with our military, it's likely that we will have to consider the extended role that we'll play in any escalation or retaliations that occur. So I have three major questions that I'd like you to address. One is the very realistic possibility that a limited strike will not achieve your objective, the targeted strike to debilitate Assad, resulting in a deterrence of his further use of the weapons of mass destruction. both for him and around the world. And I just asked to look back in Iraq where there were thoughts that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass, both for him and around the world. And I just asked to look back in Iraq where there were thoughts that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. He was deposed, captured, and hanged. And what you're advocating for falls very short of that action. Why would taking this lesser action deter him or other dictators over the world when clearly that example of Saddam Hussein has not, with this blow, are we not indirectly assisting the opposition forces in gaining strength? And lastly, with the control and use of chemical weapons, General Dempsey, you stated that the targets you're talking about will be directly linked to means of control of these chemical weapons without actually releasing the weapons themselves. And I'm wondering what your strategy and objectives are regarding securing these weapons across Syria, especially if Assad loses control or if the regime falls. How we secure them given the non-support from Russia and China, in particular from Al-Qaeda and terrorists, people who have stated very explicitly their desire to harm our people and American interests.
Very good questions, Congresswoman, and first of all, thank you for your service very, very much. General, do you want to just take the last one and then we can take the other two?
Yeah, I can do that. I guess this is what we get for training you how to ask questions about military operations. And thanks for your service. I'll take on the question of security of the weapons in the event of the fall of the regime. We do have, at the classified level, contingency plans with regional partners to secure a limited number of sites. The challenge we have with that is the number of potential sites, and the regime has a tendency to move their chemical weapons around. We think to secure them, but at some point it may not be to secure them. And so I would just tell you that we do have contingency plans with regional partners for the security of the weapons, but it's a very heavy lift.
With respect to the limited strike, not achieving the objective, I think the General has spoken to that earlier, that he has confidence that we have the ability to be able to achieve our objective, if not in the first, volley, certainly we have the ability to achieve that objective. And secondly, you said, would it inadvertently or would it not, in fact, help the opposition? And I've said many times, as a collateral component of this, any degradation of Assad's military will, of course, be of benefit to the opposition, but that is not the fundamental purpose of the initiative the President is asking you to engage in.
Ron DeSantis, come forward.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to all the witnesses, and thank you all for your service, particularly military service. Secretary Kerry, you spoke about how the use of this gas breached the norms of civilized behavior, international norms, and that we need to enforce this norm, kind of like you would enforce lessons learned by children and bullies, I think that you had said. And I know you got a little irritated about the Benghazi issue, and it was not on your watch, and you're not responsible. But as I look at this, that same line of reasoning should have applied to Benghazi. The assassination of a diplomat breaches norms that were recognized probably far longer than norms against use of sarin gas, and yet the U.S. has not acted to avenge the death of the 4 Americans, including our ambassador, who were massacred in Benghazi. And that lack of response, I think, using the same line of reasoning, certainly could embolden terror groups and Islamic malcontents that they can do this and that we may not respond forcefully. Now, you're not responsible for that, but there is a frustration among some of my constituents about how we've handled that. Not on your watch, but I just wanted to clear up how some of us view that.
Well, Congressman, let me speak to it, because I appreciate completely. I think it's a little different from the earlier question, so to speak. I appreciate and respect completely the need for justice to be done. And believe me, we have this discussion in the State Department and in the White House about the steps that are being taken. And there are steps being taken. That is not a back burner issue. And in an appropriate setting, I'd be delighted to share with you exactly what is going on. But that accountability is a priority for the President's priority.
We appreciate that, and we are waiting for that. Secretary Kerry, do you think that striking Syria for Assad using poison gas will have an effect on whether Iran decides to continue with its nuclear program or abandon it?
I think whether or not the United States stands up at this moment, as I've described earlier, to enforce this almost century-old prohibition on the use of weapons will, in fact, affect not only Iran, but loads of people's thinking about whether the United States is good for its word.
So you think that it is possible that Iran, seeing a limited strike against Assad, that they will actually decide to abandon
No, I didn't
weapons?
say that. I said it will affect their thinking about how serious the United States is. I can't predict what they're going to decide to do or whether they'll abandon it or not, but I'll tell you this, it will enter into their calculation about what we might or might not be prepared to do. And if we don't do anything, I absolutely guarantee you that too will enter into their calculation.
I guess my fear is that they've already made their determination and they're going to continue with it, but I guess we will find out. In terms of these opposition groups, and I think it's true that when you degrade Assad, you are benefiting the opposition groups, and I think that the bulk of that energy right now is with Sunni supremacists and Al-Qaeda affiliated terrorists, but it is difficult to kind of figure out where everybody is in all this. And there was a quote that you had given about when we were evaluating the Libyan opposition. You said, we didn't know who all the people were in Eastern Europe either. We don't always know who they all are. If you asked Lafayette the question, if he knew everyone over here when he helped us during the American Revolution, what he'd say, I think that you have to kind of have a sense of the course of history and what they're fighting for. Is that pretty much, do you stand by that quote and kind of the difficulty in evaluating? And I ask that because, we've seen with the Arab Spring, we've seen the reaction to us going into Afghanistan, Iraq, and kind of what is the animating impulse in these Muslim countries. And there was a comment about we'd like to see a pro-Western government take the place of Assad, and I have not seen any evidence to suggest that that's what would be the primary impulse motivating the people in a post-Assad Syria. Indeed, I fear that what would motivate them would be the Muslim Brotherhood, Sunni Islamism, of course, Al-Qaeda type terror groups. And so that's the sense of history that a lot of us see, and that's why when we're looking at a potential strike, how that could affect the civil war, we don't want to be doing something that's going to lead to an outcome that's as bad as having Assad or potentially even worse.
Congressman, a very good question, and the answer is there are some really bad actors in some of these groups in Syria. Al-Nusra is not the worst, but they're really bad. And there are a couple of other groups that, some people characterize as worse. But one of the things that is concentrating the president's thinking about Syria and the reason for supporting the moderate opposition is to have a buttress against those folks who, if Syria continues to move in the direction it's been going, if there's an implosion, they will be strengthened. There will be more of them. This is, in fact, something that does bring Russia and the United States together. When I was in Russia and met with Putin, he discussed specifically their concerns about the extremists. But Syria, traditionally, historically, in the recent years, has been a secular country. And the vast majority of the opposition, 75%, 70% of it, is hopeful to have a very different Syria, free Syria, Syria that has minority rights protected, that is inclusive, and that's what the opposition has in written form committed themselves to and is talking about wherever they go in the world. So I hope you will recognize that the best way to isolate that extremist opposition is to more the extremist components of the Syrian fabric is to more rapidly build up the opposition and diminish Assad's capacity to prolong this.
Joaquin Castro of Texas. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, gentlemen, for your service, first of all, and for your testimony today. There have been a lot of strong arguments made on both sides, both in favor of taking action and, quite frankly, against taking action. I've had a chance to hear about 1,500 comments from social media posts to emails, calls, faxes, etc. And just to recap, I think I've boiled it down to the big arguments for example,
First, that there's a moral imperative to act because of the use of chemical weapons. Second, that we need to strike to prevent repeat behavior. Third, that inaction will embolden others, specifically Iran and North Korea. Fourth, that the U.S. reputation is on the line, that we need to show that we're not bluffing and that the world can count on our word. And five, the effect on our allies. The arguments against include that this war is not worthwhile, that there are extremists on both sides, that America should focus on its own problems, that military action will have no real effect, that the scope is not enough, that these actions are not enough to change things. Third, that military action will make things worse, that there'll be collateral damage, increase in refugees, war will lead to more war. Fourth, that we should take alternative action. You've heard folks say that we should try diplomacy or try to do this with a coalition if that's possible. And then fifth, that the war is too expensive, and again, that America should focus on its own issues at home. And in making this decision, I publicly stated in San Antonio, the town that I represent, which is Military City, USA, that I am open to the idea of military strikes, but that I want to review the evidence, and that's where I still stand today. And so with that in mind, I have a few quick questions for you. The first is, if we do act militarily, or if we decide not to, if this Congress votes yes or no, what is the policy that we're establishing, or the precedent that we're establishing? And, important for me, what will this mean for future generations of Americans, post-baby boomer generations of Americans, Generation X and millennials, and Americans that have not been born yet? Where will that leave America for them?
Well, Congressman, those are all very appropriate considerations, each of the ones that you've listed. Where will we be? I believe that we would be not establishing a precedent, we would be upholding a precedent. We would be upholding the unbelievably committed global reaction to the horror of World War I, to the use of gas rampantly, and to the world's condemnation of that, the fact that over 180 countries have signed on to this convention. We will be upholding it. And from the perspective of, you say, Generation X or baby boomers, whatever you want to assign as a concept, I think it's a vital statement about multilateral international commitment to norms by which you, your generation, and the future generations would want to live. And I would hope it'd be something you would overwhelmingly support, because it's a matter of values and interests coming together in an appropriate manner. And I think the absence of our willingness to enforce that would be very dangerous for our country for the long term.
And Mr. Secretary, let me ask you, what precedent do we set if we don't act?
Well, for the United States of America, it would be a very unusual statement of our unwillingness to uphold something that we have fought for and been part of for a long, long period of time. I think we would be walking away from the responsibility and perhaps signaling a new moment of confrontation and difficulty for our country in many other respects and many other issues.
Do you feel that it would fundamentally start to change America's role in the world?
Well, it would change the world's perception of America's willingness to live up to its traditional role in the world, and it would certainly have a profound impact on people's judgments about what we're willing to stand up for and not stand up for. And I caution you, politely and humbly, I believe very, very deeply it will invite other contests of conflict that will put us to the test and potentially with much greater consequences.
You go to Mr. Burke, always a gift.
Thank you, Chairman. I appreciate it. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your service. And I associate myself with representing from Hawaii and serving in Iraq and knowing the issues go on. One of the benefits of sitting down here on the bottom row is you get to listen. You hear a lot of things, you get a lot of questions asked. And I know that I'm not going to steal the thunder of others that may come, but there's some, what I have heard today, though, still concerns me greatly. I walked into this hearing concerned and very deeply concerned about the actions we're taking. I'm still there. Many of those have to do with military questions, and the questions that come from the, statements such as Secretary Hagel, you made that there's no clarity on the ground, that there's no good options in Syria. These kind of things that lead me to an understanding of what happened is, the limited involvement nature that has been talked about over and over here, and the high confidence that limited nature would be effective. But if it would not, your statement just a moment ago, well, after the first volley, leaves an open ending, well, there's another volley and another volley that would come if it did not achieve the end. I want to just those for two questions on this issue. According to the unclassified assessment that was given, there were information suggested that a possible chemical attack was imminent on August 21st. In fact, what was said was from August 18th to Sunday through Wednesday the 21st, there were Syrian chemical weapons personnel operating in the area. The report goes on to say that 3 days prior to the attack, they were screened with human signals and geospatial intelligence gathered, schooling the targets and preparing for a chemical attack. With over 48 hours notice in the recent history of chemical weapons being used in Syria, did the U.S. military not take action or quickly enough to convene the United States Union Security Council? Why did we not act, knowing the history, and I'm going to come back to this part later, as quickly as possible? Why was there nothing done at that point?
Because that information isn't real time in terms of the way it comes in, goes through the process, so it wasn't done.
And you really, and I appreciate that answer, but you really now concern me even more that our intelligence operations, without getting into in this setting, discussion of this, if it was not real time, we're finding out after the fact, then some of my concern, General Dempsey, would be that the limited engagement to, as you said, take out the operation or the engagement of the chemical weapons and not destroy all the chemical weapons, what is the confidence level, although you have stated high, why should I or anybody else in this committee say that there's a concern that our intelligence is not real time enough to answer your question?
Different kinds of intelligence, sir. As you probably know, and thanks for your service too, by the way, there's signals intelligence, which is what you're referring to. There's full motion video. There's national technical means that allow us to establish pattern of life. It's different kinds of intelligence.
But with the movements, there is a concern that the initial assessment could be wrong, and there would be, I guess what I'm getting at is there seems to be a lot of thought out there that this is a one-strike operation. Although I'm getting, rumor now, not rumor, but the discussions of a 30-day or 40-day or 60-day, 90-day window. I guess that's the concern I'm having. Many in America are saying, we're going to throw a few cruise missiles or a shot across the bow, as the term was used. That's not what we're looking at here. This could be are we saying this could be a sustained attack, or is this and without getting in or telegraphing, that's a concern. I'll stop it there. I won't ask you to answer that. But that is a concern that I think many should have. In this atmosphere also, very quickly, real close, Secretary, how we, after the initial gas attacks early in the year, we upped our ante to those that were fighting against Assad. Do we have, and again, how much of that has actually got there in a real short answer? How much of that equipment or assistance is actually making a difference in it? Because there was, I think, when the senators and others have said, we've not actually been able to get that equipment to them.
I think we have made a difference, but not as much yet as we would like, but I don't want to go into any other details.
I understand that. I appreciate that. But in light of what we're doing here, I think it's a very pertinent information because, like I said, if we do this...
Well, one of the reasons, if I can just tell you very quickly, it's because it wasn't authorized until a couple of months ago.
I get that.
We're just getting up on it.
But if we were to do this, it's one of those, go back to saying the former secretary, that if we break it, we own it. And this is a concern here. Also, I want to go back to something here that you said earlier.
We didn't break it.
I understand. But if we shoot missiles in there, we're involving ourselves in degrading stock. One quick question. I'm going to give you a chance to walk back something. And it disturbed me when you said it. Now, I think it was a misspec, so I'm going to give you a chance. Basically, you said at this point in time, the reason we're acting now is the level of death or the level of carnage had risen to a level in which you felt like you needed to act. In my mind, what you just said a few minutes or a little while ago was that we had to have a lot of bodies to make a compelling case and that one didn't matter. And I don't believe that's what you meant. No. So I'm going to give you a chance to walk that statement back because if we're truly doing this because of death, then one would matter, and we've been doing this for several months.
I appreciate it, Congressman. I don't want to leave any misinterpretation with respect to that. In the first instances, we had a lot of difficulty getting a lockdown on the level of intelligence that made everybody comfortable, and partly because it was a smaller event, you didn't have the kind of evidence, there wasn't the kind of immediacy, social media, other things that we have here, signatures, SIGINT, and so forth. We just didn't have it. In this instance, we do, and it happens also to be an even more egregious event. But that's not, the body numbers aren't the distinction, it's the level of the evidence, the quality, and the comfort level. And at that point in time, the president, didn't want to rush into something.
Well, I think these are the very things that cause my concern.
Going out to Mark Meadows, North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank each of you for your patience and your tenure here at this hearing. I want to ask you specifically and go into some of the questions with Hezbollah, and let's look at their involvement. If there was an attempt on their part to gain access or the intelligence to chemical weapons, under the authorization that the President seeks, would you see them as an acceptable target for having the ability to acquire that or the attempt to acquire that?
Well, again, I don't want to get into targeting here. It's inappropriate, except to say to you, the President's...
Would that be covered under his authorization?
No, the President's authorization does not apply to Iran or Hezbollah or other entities. It's not entity-specific. It's with respect to the Assad regime's capacity with respect to chemical weapons. And it is solely focused on the degrading and the preventing of the use by the Assad regime.
So are we actively engaged to make sure that Hezbollah is not gaining access to these chemical weapons to be used in another theater?
Well, General,
we do know a little bit about that, whether they even want any part of chemical weapons, and if so, what might be the instrument. I can tell you our regional partners are very interested in that question, but it really would be classified.
Okay, so you're saying then if Syria transferred their chemical weapons to Iran, to a state-controlled entity, the receiving of those chemical weapons would not be one that would dictate action from us?
No, it is not. These are not externally focused at all, and I want to emphasize that. I will add that there is evidence that both Iran and Hezbollah have opposed the use of chemical weapons.
Okay, so let me go on further, because I think Secretary Kerry, your quote was, do we mean what we say? And so I think that's a critical question today, because is this a new departure? Are we going to start a new foreign policy where we truly mean what we say? Because about 6 minutes into your testimony, you mentioned that there was 11 other events where gas or chemical weapons was used there in Syria, and yet we've done nothing. And so when we start to look at that, is this a new day for foreign policy where we're going to start to say something and mean it and draw a red line that truly is a red line?
Well, let me say with respect to those other incidents, this is an intelligence community assessment.
But this is not new intelligence.
No.
I mean, we've known this,
I know this
for many months.
Congressman, I know this because I've been forefront. I was here.
I've read your reports, yeah.
Arguing this and talking about it last year too. The problem was again with many of those, the quality of the evidence, the level of the event, and people were uncomfortable with the notion that in fact it called for action, but it didn't necessarily rise to the level of what the president has decided.
So what is that level? Is it 1,000 deaths?
No, it's not based on deaths. It's based on I think an exhaustion.
Because either use requires action or it doesn't.
I beg your pardon?
Either when they use it.
Well, I don't know. What was the date when the president drew the red line publicly? I don't know.
But it had been,
I think some of those events were prior to that.
Sure.
And so I think there's been a steady
if we go back all the way to August of last year.
And I think there was a steady effort by the administration and others to try to send messages, and they were sent very powerfully, I might add. Messages were sent to the Russians They were sent directly through to Iranians. The messages were sent.
But today, we're talking about military action.
Now I think there's a sense of those efforts all having been exhausted, and this therefore being a remedy of last resort.
Okay, so when do we ultimately get that? When can our enemies and our allies depend on us to take action when we have these kind of things that happen? Because
When the House
CIA
of
reports...
Representatives passes the president's request for this resolution.
as it relates to Syria and everybody else. Because this is just Syria, but I'm talking about internationally.
Well, internationally, Congressman, I think we've been proving our word good on everything the president said he's going to do. He's drawn down in Iraq. He's drawing down in Afghanistan. We're working on the Middle East peace process. We've been involved with Egypt and many other countries. We're continuing to prosecute Al-Qaeda in Yemen and elsewhere. We've decimated Al-Qaeda in Pakistan. We're working on the bilateral security arrangement with Afghanistan. These are things that are all going on, and I think, these broad sweeping assessments don't actually do justice to what is happening.
We're going to Ted Yoho of Florida. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for enduring the length of time here, and I hope you men are men of prayer, and that we seek guidance and wisdom as we work through this. And I agree with many of my colleagues that our foreign policy is confusing to the world, our allies, and to the American people, and that is why I think we're sitting here today. The primary role of the U.S. government, according to our Constitution, is national security. I do not see a direct threat to the U.S. from the internal civil war in Syria, as deplorable as it is. We've got 14 to 2,000 people killed by chemical weapons. I think that's despicable. But what about the 108,000 that have been killed by conventional warfare? Is that not just as despicable? I cannot, I will not, nor shall not support intervention in this conflict. Our action would be one of attacking a sovereign nation, a nation that did not attack us, an act of war, and if we start war, we invite war, do we not? And I view this as unconstitutional to attack a country that did not attack us. I and the people I represent said, not just no, but something like heck no. Don't get involved in this. And the same thing I hear over and over here. The CWC agreement signed by 189 countries states that any country that produces, transports, stores, sells, or uses chemical weapons are in violation of that agreement. Who are those countries? You've got North Korea, possibly Russia, as Secretary Hagel said, was supplying Syria with possible chemical weapons. Maybe Iran or China, the U.S. There are probably other countries. So if we act now against Syria, does that mean we act against other nations? And do we act in totality? And do we act now? Where does it stop? Once you cross a red line, and this goes back to our confusing foreign policies, it was a red line, it wasn't a red line. I just think we need clarity in this. And I want to know where the 188 countries are that signed the agreement, the UN, the Arab League, and NATO, demanding that we come to the table on one side and Mr. Assad on the other side. I implore you guys and the administration to find a diplomatic solution, because all I've heard is military intervention. And I know you guys have talked about diplomatic solutions, but the clout of the United States and that we supply the majority of the foreign aid around the world, that we need to bring people and demand people come to the table. And this is a moment in time in history where we, America, can lead a new direction, a direction where we can bring together a coalition of countries that the other 188 that signed the CWC agreement and negotiate a political and diplomatic solution. It's a time for a new direction in our foreign policy, especially in the Middle East. And if we can win this, and it can be done and won with diplomacy and not with guns and bombs. Senator Kerry, you said yesterday that you could not guarantee that U.S. troops would not be on the ground.
Well, I did guarantee that there wouldn't be, and I guaranteed it again today.
I've got the transcripts right here.
I think if you read the whole transcript, I said clearly there will be no troops on the ground.
All right, even if the weapons fell into the hands of the bad people.
There's nothing in this resolution whatsoever that put troops on the ground.
I just want to clarify that. Thank you. General Dempsey, you stated that we would need thousands of support troops on the ground. You didn't say in Syria, but close by. Where would they be?
I'm fine with my process.
Not related to this resolution. That's related to whether we took a decision to support the opposition.
Okay, well, the way I read this briefing out of the CRS as of 2 days ago, it said in Syria, if we attack Syria.
No, sir.
Okay. Do we have support and authorization from Turkey to use their air bases, or can that not be divulged?
That is something we should talk about in the question.
Okay.
Same with Jordan and other places.
Does the CWC, or according to you, Mr. Secretary Kerry, the world's resolve or the international community, is there a doctrine that the U.S. should lead in world conflicts like this? Why is it always America out front? I know we've got the best military, and I'm very proud of that. But why are we out leading this again?
Well, let me answer that. And Mr. Chairman, I have to take more than 40 seconds to do it, but it's a vital question for Americans and for this issue. Congressman, I wish the world were a little more simple. I grew up in the Cold War. I think all of us did. And it was pretty East-West communism, the West. That's not the world we live in today. When the Berlin Wall fell, so did all of the things that tampened down a lot of sectarian, religious, and other kinds of conflict in the world. And the truth is, we're 1 week away from 9/11 commemoration. 9/11 happened because there were ungoverned spaces in which people who wanted to fight the West, who are culturally and historically opposed to modernity, want to attack us. And they did. And I think most people, in making judgments about how to keep our country safe, make the judgment that there are a lot of folks out there who are committed to violent acts against lots of different people because that's what they want to do. And we have to defend ourselves differently today and work to deal with these issues in a different way than we ever have before. Now, I just say to you, we do have direct interests in what's happening in Syria. There is a direct interest in our credibility with respect to this issue. And you ask the question, why does the United States have to be out there? Well, because what our forebears and, what those you ever been to the cemetery in France, above those beaches? Why'd those guys have to go do that? Because we were standing up with people for a set of values and fighting for freedom, and no country has liberated as much land or fought as many battles as the United States of America and turned around and given it back to the people who live there and who can own it and run it. We are the indispensable nation. This is because of who we are and what we've achieved, and we should be proud of that. And we have a great tradition to try to live up to in terms of trying to help people to see a peaceful road, not a road of jihadism.
Yeah.
A lot of people out in the Middle East count on us, moderate Arab world, not religious extremists. They count on us to help them be able to transition. That's part of what the Arab Spring is about, and it's not going to end quickly. It's not going to be over just like that. Our own struggle for freedom took a long time. So I think we have to have a longer view here. And I think we have to think about the ways in which we can protect ourselves, and I guarantee you, if we don't stand up against chemical weapons in this instance, we are not serving our national security interests.
I am we go now to Mr. Luke Messer of Indiana. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think someone has to go last today. That is me. I certainly thank my colleagues for sitting there on the front row with me. Thank the chairman for calling us all back to what I think is very important work. Thank you for your service and your stamina today as well. We're entering almost the 4th hour of this hearing. I appreciate and respect the President's decision to bring this matter of authorization before Congress. I was one of a broad group of 150 folks that signed on to a letter that requested that. I appreciate the President heeding that request. I understand the legal arguments about whether or not it was necessary for him to do that. I would associate myself with Congressman Perry's comments that that decision has now been made, and the President has brought this before Congress, and I believe it is very important that the President abide by that vote.
I won't revisit all the other questions that others have asked today. I will tell you that I make that comment as someone who, if I had to vote today on whether or not to authorize force against Syria under the circumstances presented before me, I would vote yes. I certainly believe it's a vote of conscience. I recognize that the people of good conscience can come to different conclusions based on the facts. And there is no more somber responsibility for a member of Congress than a decision about whether or not to send more men into combat, because we all know what the inevitable result of that can be. The facts as I see them are that chemical weapons were used, innocent children were gassed. Clearly our allies like Israel in the region believe action is needed. Clearly evil dictators in Iran, North Korea, and elsewhere are watching. And undoubtedly inaction will embolden them. I'm no fan of this president's foreign policy. Frankly, I believe that mismanagement and many instances over the course of the last several years have made the problems in Syria worse. But I want to make a point to all of